My role with Bill has evolved from the lighting guy to the production manager to the guy who designed the sets to the guy who started writing the set list to the create whatever they call as a creative director. It's been an evolution that's taken place over 51 years. The past 15 years, I became the one person who all of the ideas for television and film projects would land on my lap. It really started with Last Play at Shea, which I also executive produced. Billy was being approached by a lot of different filmmakers because he put it out there that he wanted to film The Last Play at Shea. He felt that it was a story that needed to be told, and he wanted it to be a bigger story than just a Billy Joel concert at Shea Stadium. I'll never forget, we were on a plane, and he had a folder full of pitches from 4 or 5 directors and 4 or 5 producers, and he was frustrated. He's reading this stuff, and he just closes it, and he looks at me, and he just hands it to me, and he goes, "Why don't you do this?" And I was like, "Okay, what do you want me to do?" He says, "Go through and read this stuff and tell me who you think would be the best fit." As with all things Billy, I took it with a grain of salt because I thought maybe he just didn't feel like it at that moment. So I really, I kind of looked at it, but I put it on the top shelf. About 2 weeks later, he called me up and he said, "So did you pick somebody?" And I was like, "What? You were serious?" He says, "Yeah, I gave it to you. You should produce this thing." Sort of from that point on, and God rest his soul, Jeff Schock was still around and was still very much in Billy's ear about stuff, but he really wasn't working at the time. So I just sort of thought that he was the one that was getting pitches, and he talked to Dennis, and then they would run it past Billy, and Billy read a couple of ideas. But what ended up happening throughout the next couple of years is that anything that came across Dennis Arfa's desk, Billy's agent, to talk about, possible film opportunities, whether it was scripted ideas or shows based on songs or the multitude of things that get offered to a guy like Billy Joel with an incredible IP, I ended up getting to look at it because Billy would figure that I'm the visual guy, so why wouldn't it make sense for him to talk about anything visual? Sounds very simplistic, but that's how Billy rolls, right? Last Play at Shea comes out. It's a critical success. It sort of cements a little bit of Billy's critical legitimacy back where it belonged. It was sort of the entree to Lee Eastman being able to get the Kennedy Center to pay attention to Bill. It was one of the things that sort of created this wider critical community embrace of Billy around that time. And then throughout the years, things would come across my desk and things would come across Dennis's desk, and it would always come to me. We're about in the middle of the Madison Square Garden run. I think we're maybe 2 years in, not the middle. So about 2 years in, I get approached by a director, named director. I'm not going to drop his name here because he didn't do the project. He was asked by his network to reach out to me to get some intel on Billy Joel because he wasn't a Billy Joel fan. We meet. I give him Last Play at Shea, and I give him the Russia doc, and I give him Fred Schroer's book. Do this stuff and come back to me and see if you want to do it. He comes back. He says, "I'm blown away. I definitely want to tell this story." He makes a pitch. We sit down. We take it to the water's edge, meet Billy. Billy's, "Oh, okay, this sounds really like a good idea." At the time, we really didn't have any end to the story. There was no hook to the story. We didn't know how long Madison Square Garden was going to go. We didn't know whether it was the right time to really tell a comprehensive documentary. Long story short, he decides not to do it. And then throughout the next couple of years, get an offer, get an offer, get an offer. Do you want to do it? Do you want to do it? And Billy would say, "No, no, no, no. We really don't have any reason to tell this story." Susan Lacey, who's a neighbor, and I think she said this to you guys. She lived in Sag Harbor. I live in East Hampton. And she wanted to do a Billy Joel doc. So through Dennis Arfa, Billy's agent, her agent reaches out. They make a call. "Do you want to meet with Susan Lacey?" Sure. So I go over and I bring a laptop and I've got some of the archive stuff there. And we start talking, and it's apparent to me that she knows the top line about Billy Joel, but she doesn't really know much. She knows his impact on the culture. She knows how popular he is. She doesn't know him. So I open up the laptop and I start playing a show that he did with James Lipton inside the Actors Studio. which I don't know if you've ever seen this, but he's freaking hysterical on this. I mean, it is like grab your gut funny stuff. And I'm playing this for her, and I see her eyes start to widen, and she starts to laugh. She says, "I never knew he was this funny. I never knew that this was the personality." She should know because she hadn't run across it. So a couple hours, we have a great time. We realize that we could probably work pretty well together. I tell Bill, we have a conversation. He says, "Yeah, okay, it's a good idea, but I don't want to do this." Fast forward about a year later, I'm friends with Todd Milner and Sean Hayes. I'm really more friends with Todd Milner, who's Sean Hayes' partner at Hazy Mills. And Milner and Sean had pitched Billy on a scripted show 5 or 6 years before, and it got shut down. But they always wanted to do something. So we have lunch, and he says, "Listen, what about doing a Billy Joel doc?" And I said, "I don't know, write me something." So he writes a one page, due diligence. I read it. Anything I see, I put in front of Billy that I think, he might have interest in. I show it to Billy, and like Billy just goes, "Yeah, sure, why not?" It was that simple. It was like, "Yeah, okay. I think I'm ready now." It sounds like a pretty good concept. The ironic part about that is that one sheet bears no resemblance to the film that Steve and Jessica made. So I called Todd. I said, "He's interested." He said, "Okay, well, let's circle the wagons." A week later, he calls me and he said, "Would you be interested if Tom Hanks and Gary Getzman signed on as co-executive producers?" So I go, "Oh, I don't know. Tom Hanks,
I guess.
I guess,
Yeah.
whatever,
Tom who? I'm sorry.
Tom Ho."
Yeah.
And they want to do this, but they have a director they want to recommend, and she's a woman. And I'm like, this sounds pretty funny. Like, could it possibly be? So I get on the phone with Getzman, and he says, "We will do this. We want to do this. We think it's an HBO project, and we want Susan Lacey to direct." And I'm like, "Well, then the gods are conspiring." So honestly, we had a conversation internally, and we said, "Let's just do the math." You have Todd and Sean, which are reputable names as producers in Hollywood. You have Gary and Tom, who have a relationship that's super deep with HBO, and they are the 1,000-pound gorilla. And they're recommending Susan Lacey, who has an overall with HBO and who has made 50 documentaries. I don't know what the number is at American Masters, but 4 or 5 at HBO. We know for sure that the film will get made, and it will get made well, and it will be presented at the highest critical level because of HBO's very high bar. So it felt like it was the right thing to do. One of the things that Billy said to me was, "I don't want to do anything. I do not want to tell any stories. I do not want to be involved. You have access to all of the archive material. You know where all the bodies are buried, Steve. You know how to get all that material. Let them tell an honest story. I don't want to do anything." Ironically, one of Susan's non-negotiables was that there could be no involvement from the artist, no involvement other than the obvious that they would be the subject of the documentary, but they didn't have any final cut contractual limits. Really, at the end of the day, could not be involved in any of the decision making on the narrative and the storytelling. As we got a little closer, I had a very frank conversation with Bill, and I said, if we decide to do this, Billy, we can't say anything about it. And all of the stuff that you've avoided talking about or that you've not really wanted to have your private thoughts made public, that stuff is all going to be fodder. It's all going to be, part of the material that's going to make this documentary. And he said to me, he said, "I don't really give a shit about that anymore, Steve. I just want it to be about the music." My response to him was, well, I think out of all of the directors out there, this is one director that only cares about the music. And I knew that from where Susan was coming from. Her body of work is a testament to the fact that she makes films about artists and their craft, not about artists and their life. Their lives contribute to the craft. And anytime part of the storytelling takes away from that direct line between their creative output, it ends up on the cutting room floor. She's not a tabloid. She doesn't go for the low hanging fruit. But what that means is, Billy Joel is the sum of his parts. So there's some stuff in there that's not pretty. There's some stuff in there that you don't want to look at. There's some stuff there that you really don't want people to pay any more attention to anymore. But it's all going to be out there. I think when we started down this road, he was pretty well aware of the fact that, warts and all, that this film was going to have to be able to go in places where might make it uncomfortable. I will tell you guys, it was more uncomfortable for me than anybody else in this process, because I had to assist them in finding this stuff, and I had to watch them as they started to craft this narrative. And all I kept thinking about was sitting on a couch next to Billy, screening this frickin' thing for him and looking out of the corner of my eye with my shoulders up to my neck, because though I also couldn't have any narrative input, I do have an opinion, and my opinions were listened to and respected. And I appreciated Jessica, especially Jessica and Susan, listening to me and asking my counsel and asking my advice on how to approach certain things and how they would get the most information from certain things. So my questions were, well, why do you want to know this stuff? I mean, I would ask these conversations, but, at the end of the day, what they came up with, I had no vote, basically. I knew that at some point, Billy'd be sitting next to me, looking at me, knowing that I'm the EP, even though he knew he had no vote. The theory of how these things work and the reality of sitting there are two entirely different things. So I think my ulcer was directly related to my emotional commitment to my friend. He's Billy Joel. He's been my boss for 51 years. He's given me a life beyond my wildest dreams. At the end of the day, he's my friend, and we've been through life challenges together. He buried my father, for Christ's sake. We're mishpucha. So there was part of me that always knew that maybe I was looking at things through my eyes, wondering how he would look at things and anticipating how I would react to those things, not how he would. So a lot of emotions tied around the whole process. That's how it started. But with all projects, like you guys know, once they start, they get a life of their own. People talk to people, information gets transferred, ideas get tossed around, and you hope art gets created, which these women and the two editors and the associate producers, Katie and Sydney, that you worked with, they all fell in love with this guy in a way that propelled them to tell this really, really honest story. And they all had the same sort of takeaway, I think. I had one conversation with Susan. We were driving to Richie Cannata's studio to do the interview with Richie pretty early on. And she asked me, what's my take on Billy as an artist? And my analogy with him was always the same, that I look at him like a diamond. A diamond is created out of coal under intense pressure and intense heat. It's the roughest, sort of ugliest form of raw energy. And through that pressure and through that heat, you get the most beautiful gem in the world. And I think that this body of work that we're blessed to have from him came from the most intense pressure and the most pain and the most heat that any individual can kind of go through. Look, he says it in the film. He says, life's not a musical, it's a Greek tragedy. Once you get to know Bill, and once you learn from this documentary through the examples that Susan and Jessica have given us as examples of that craft developing, you realize it's an extraordinary body of work, because the guy went through an extraordinary emotional pressure cooker his whole life. We read about this with great artists all over the world, and all out through history. Ain't none of them are, happy-go-lucky, everyday kind of average guys. Like, the real great art comes from people cutting their freaking ears off.
Sort of the layers that you're applying when you're thinking about this. How's Billy going to react? How am I going to react to Billy? At the same time, you're watching this come together, but you've lived it and you've been there the whole time. So was there a challenge in being able to take a step back and seeing the forest for the trees, in terms of yes, this is a clear, coherent narrative, versus knowing everything that had to get chopped out?
It was pretty easy for me, because the thematic structure was very clearly laid out from the beginning. Susan had a very clear message. And she will say that her initial outline, which she never showed me, which she never showed anybody, she hewed pretty close to that, even with the discovery. And, you look at that and you wonder, chicken and the egg, like, did she have this and this is the kind of stuff she uncovered, or did the stuff she uncover lay into her framework? And I think it's more the latter. I think she knew enough about the artistry and the creative process in an individual like Billy Joel that if she built this framework around, just look at it like pinging, like if everything pinged back to the music, if everything pinged back to the art, then you couldn't really go off track. Living these experiences, if anything, I provided more color to them. That I was able to, color in the edges and give you a wider view of what was going on when those things were going on. I'll give you an example. Billy Joel Tonight, which is that the great footage of I Only Have the Words, and I think there's a bit of Ain't No Crime in there from Billy Joel Tonight, a little bit of Billy the Kid, maybe. That was the first thing we ever shot. And Elizabeth had a friend named Richie Nam, who was a video producer. And tells you how far-reaching Elizabeth was thinking. Nobody did music specials in those days. Like they didn't exist. And she said that if we record what's going on live, everyone will get an idea of how great this is. Because she saw early on that the live was so much better than what the product was coming out on record, so much more vibrant. And the thing you didn't get when you listened to those early recordings was Billy's personality and his stage presence and his ability to sell a song. I had a lot of that stuff, stored away, and they were pulling these bits and pieces. And I was like, we shot the day before. What do you mean you shot the day before? Well, we came in the day before, and I think they were going to try and intercut it, but they didn't realize that they couldn't. They were wearing different clothes, like no one wore the same wardrobe. So everything that was shot the day before couldn't be integrated into the Billy Joel Tonight show. So there's a performance of, and I don't know if it actually made the cut, but there's a performance of The Great Suburban Showdown or Last of the Big Time Spenders. I'm not sure either one of those, from a rehearsal. And it's a fully fleshed out performance. It lived up until the last cut. I think the recorded version of Stop in Nevada, which is on the companion, is from a rehearsal from Billy Joel Tonight. You wouldn't have known any of this stuff if I hadn't have been there. Brian would remember some of these things too, but he wasn't intimately involved in making this. I kept going back to that place. Oh, you're going to talk about The Stranger? Well, let me think about all the times that The Stranger was performed. And the Kazoo performance of The Stranger was like one of those ones that we all loved because it was the band and it was live. And it was the first time it was after they recorded it in the studio. And you wouldn't have known that if I hadn't sort of remembered those kind of things. You live your life, you forget all this stuff. Like, oh, really? Then they show a picture of me with long hair and a Marlboro 100 sticking out of my mouth. And I go, oh my God, like, nice look.
Were there any new moments that you didn't even know still existed on tape that you were surprised?
Most of the stuff I had probably seen. The Summit stuff, the Summit and Capitol Center, that was a thing, in those days. There were two venues that had IMAX screens in the country, the Houston Summit and the Capitol Center. They bought their 3-camera system, and you would go in there, and if you let them project the artist on these screens, I mean, imagine like it's de rigueur now, but like in those days, there were two venues, and no one carried video.
Right.
And then if you let them do that, you would walk away with a 3/4-inch tape because Brian would have to send them a stereo mix, and you'd walk away with a line cut of those performances. And those were the only copies of those shows. There was a live performance of I Would Die for You, which was the only live performance that Prince would allow to be played on TV. And that was from the Capitol Center. It was one of those two cameras.
Oh, no kidding.
From the Capitol Center. So like I knew that Stiletto, Stranger, and I think a couple of other things that didn't end up in the final cut were from those two performances that I knew we had in storage, but no one had ever seen, which is part of the joy about this companion soundtrack that John and me and Brad did, because there's a half a dozen of performances that those are the only copies. They're mono or stereo board mixes of those live performances that we got from the actual tape. So I think those were surprising me. Look, the signing day footage, we found that just before we started making this thing. two unmarked film cans. And there are 3 songs that were recorded because I saw the recorded track sheet, and it's Travel and Prayer, Ain't No Crime, and Piano Man. But there is no film of Ain't No Crime, which really pisses me off because that would have been fun to watch. And
what would Steve Gadd have done with that?
Yeah, right.
And how about that bit of business? Like Tony Levin seeing a Facebook, someone telling him to watch it because they thought it looked like him. I must have watched that thing 100 times, and I went, I think I know that bald
Right.
guy. 6 Degrees of Separation. Ruggles and I knew Gadd and Tony Levin very well because we did the One Trick Pony tour. When Phil did One Trick Pony for Paul Simon, he told Paul, you got to take Billy's guys out on the road. I was my first set design. So I went out with Paul Simon. Brian went out with Paul Simon. And that's where we, made friends with those guys, Gadd and T and Tony Levin. Tony Levin ended up playing with Paul a couple of tours. I think he did the Simon and Garfunkel tour we did. So we're all kind of, like you said, we were all kind of in Phil's little.
Yeah, I remember first, before really seeing the visual as much, I'm like, wow, this performance is fantastic. And then once I saw that Tony Levin post, I'm like, well,
that certainly explains it. Yeah.
Yeah, I knew Billy was going to be good, but to have those 2 guys sitting beside him.
Yeah, but I'll tell you, that Piano Man performance, that shook me because no harmonica.
No.
Before he ever thought to put a harmonica on it, because if he would have played it. And then you just imagine the distance between 1973 was when that was shot, right? 1973.
June. Yep.
In June. So he went in to record Piano Man in September of 73. So it's before he recorded it. So you figure the distance between when he wrote it and when he was playing in the piano bar is like, 6 months ago. Like, what were you doing 6 months ago? Playing at a piano bar, writing Piano Man. Like, that becomes super real to me. Something that's so much a part of our society, like when you see the origin of that stuff, how fascinating is that? You look at Billy's face. I remember how he used to phrase things. It was before he had his teeth done. It was like a whole different thing. And it's such, the words were fresh to him. The experience was fresh for him. When I saw that footage at the very beginning, and I played it for Jessica and for Susan, and I said, my vision was always, this is what you walk out of the theater from. Like, this is the last image you want to leave. And at some point it had a couple of different positions in the film. And I think Jessica and Susan had a pretty good knockdown drag out about where it would end up. But I think it ends up in a really beautiful place. I mean, to me, the image of Billy sitting at Madison Square Garden, putting the harmonica on, where that's the tell, he's going to do Piano Man. And then you go right to the origin of Piano Man and back. I thought that was some really cinematic filmmaking on their part.
And it's funny in watching from a year and a half ago now, the Turn the Lights Back On video, where some little snippets of that footage from that and the Stranger promotional video that you just see kind of flashing for a second in that ending. I know a bunch of us were like, what is this? What is that?
We gave our buddy Freddie Wexler a little bit of a little fairy dust for that thing.
Right.
Yeah. When we were talking to John, we didn't realize that's a lot of how he came on board was the documentary. That's when he came over from Sony and started, really going through the archive. So has that, how has that affected, subsequent releases, having that footage for the Freddie Wexler video? Did that inform the box sets at all, Yankee Stadium, things like that, as John was digging through?
I'll roll back the tape a little bit. When we started doing Last Play at Shea, I said Jeff Schock was around, but he wasn't really around. And we were in the middle of, principal photography. We were just starting to shoot interviews with Greg Whiteley, and Billy asked me if there was a job for Jeff Schock. Is there something that he could work on the film? And I was like, are you kidding me? Talk about knowing where the bodies are buried. Like Jeff Schock was the super fan of super fans. So Jeff Schock came on board as the archivist at the time. He brought the archives to a place where there was a huge collection of stuff with not a lot of organization. And Jeff was a savant. He knew where to find things, but he forgot where he put them. We got to a place where we were just about getting ready to kind of formalize it. I knew that there was going to be a doc project coming off, and we lost Jeff. And for about a year and a half, I was the only person that had access to this digital archive because no one knew how to operate it. It was so confusing and really hard. So when John came to us after he was ready to leave his position at Sony, we jumped at the chance because he had done, a lot of the Sony legacy projects. He'd been there 20 years. He knew a lot about this stuff, and he was also knew the Billy history. Bringing him on to sort of formalize the archives or get started on the archive project happened almost at the same time as Susan and I started talking about doing this. So they worked hand in glove. And it's just interesting that two documentaries drove two archives to their start position. Subsequently, John and I have, and you know this, I mean, Yankee Stadium was our vision. We wanted to, bring Yankee Stadium back to life. We've got all the footage, retransferred, and that was John and our first, foray into doing this together. And now, as you know, the archive project is officially underway. And one of the greatest advantages of doing this documentary is through your research, through Jenny's research, through Katie's work in organizing this for Airtable and the edit, we are in a much better shape to start really formalizing the archive so we can find all of this stuff in an easier way. That, plus the fact that because of the documentary requiring so much archive footage, we've had the opportunity to up-res it, to remaster it, so to speak, so that now the fans are going to be able to get these archive pieces that are now available so readily on YouTube at the highest possible quality, the best possible audio. I had forgotten that we shot both Wembley and Birmingham on the Innocent Man tour. What did we discover? An entire concert.
No kidding. I knew about Wembley, but I didn't know you
timely.
shot Birmingham.
And that's never been out. I mean, I think I teased to you guys something I didn't really remember, that we shot both nights at Sparks, and we have now uncovered and are editing the entire second night, which is a 3-camera black and white shoot of the band 2 weeks before they went in to start recording the Nylon Curtain. And I will tell you right now, there are some performances there that will blow your head off. This is the band at the peak of their power. That's David Brown and Russell and Richie playing incredible Hammond organ, and Doug playing ridiculously, unbelievably melodic bass, and, Liberty. So it's that band at their peak.
Mm-hmm.
Shot 2 nights at Sparks, which was Brian Ruggles' club, specifically to do the 3 or 4 music videos. And I didn't remember that I shot the next night. I mean, none of us remember much about that night anyway. But as it turns out, the editor who's been working on this will text me and go, "Hey, you shot this one really smart." I did. You never know how good these are and how good they hold up. But I've seen a rough cut of, 18 songs. I think it's remarkable. Billy doing Big Shot, standing in front of a 2-foot-high stage, surrounded by 25 cocktail tables. I mean,
yeah.
It's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. And the interesting thing about that is, there's not a lot of camera coverage, but it's really like if you're in the audience, you're not seeing close-ups, but you're like watching it from the bird's eye view. There's one camera shot of a girl with her arm, resting her head, and the camera's looking over her shoulder, watching Billy sing Big Shot. It's pretty funny.
Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
That's great. Yeah.
I think it's a great theater play. I think it's a good enough quality. Jay and Brian remixed it. When I shot it in 16mm black and white, it was the same year that Raging Bull came out. And I called a friend of mine to find out what film stock Scorsese shot Raging Bull on, and it was 16mm Tri-X, and we've got the exact, at least I'm told it was the exact same footage, because that was my thing, right? Like, wow, shoot it like Raging Bull. And it's transferred to 4K. It looks great. I'm thinking it'd be a fun thing to sit in a theater, in a nice Dolby, theater, and maybe it's a Fathom Events, maybe it's, one of those closed things, Who knows? We're in an interesting time in the Billy Joel world, because there's obviously nothing new, and he's not touring, and yet we have this incredible vault of performances and recordings that he's no longer precious about. I mean, I wouldn't say he's no longer precious about it. They still have to be good. I mean, I had to really do a little bit of moral digging in my heart when I was putting together this soundtrack about the Shelter Island sessions, because the Shelter Island sessions were really never supposed to be heard. Like, that whole thing changed. And then I listened to them because I had never heard them. I was in Vegas when they were out here recording them. I missed that window. I think I heard minor variation over the phone. I think Tommy held up the phone, or Brian, or Billy Zampino held up the phone. And then I listened to them and I was like, I'm not so sure I agree with Danny Korchmar.
Right.
They were a little bit fat, but they weren't that. And then I thought, well, the stuff's in the film. And that was my guiding light on the soundtrack, was that anything that was in the film has been heard now. Now it's out of the closet. So
Right.
you're not giving away something that should never be heard. There was a reviewer that said, I think it might have been Rolling Stone, that said, we hope that in a box set re-release of The River of Dreams, they'll put out the Shelter Island sessions so we can make a decision on whether Danny was right or wrong. I think that stuff was really interesting. When you asked me what I found unique, I think that those tracks were pretty unique. There are some things in the Shelter Island session that I discovered, the working sketches of River of Dreams, where Billy had written a Gregorian chant.
Brad told us about that. Yeah.
Crazy. It's just, and it's so unbelievable. And I mentioned it to Billy and he's like, oh yeah, that thing. It's like, amazing layered Gregorian chant. Zampino was in the middle of all of that, trying to, help him with the classical voicings and all of that stuff. So, my point about that is that's about it. There's not 9 albums of songs.
Right. Yeah.
Well, because know Billy's story. He'd walk into the studio with nothing.
Yeah.
And as soon as he got just enough for an album, he was out of there.
Right.
Guys like Bruce and Mellencamp, I got 25. Let me come in with 25.
For Shelter Island, in fact, there's even less because, you picked A Real Bad Time, but there was only 8 or 9, I think, for Shelter Island versus the 10 that made River. Yeah.
The fact that Billy would go in and write in the studio and then get out of there when they were done was the pressure cooker for these guys to, make that record. You guys know this because there's a few like leapfrog songs that was written for one album that didn't make it on that album that ended up going on to the next album and, kind of overflow songs. But there weren't a lot of those.
And I think they were both mostly snippets anyway. Like you could hear Blonde Over Blue in the original demo for Uptown Girl, but it was a trunk thing. It wasn't a whole song by any means.
Right.
It was more of a riff.
Right.
When we were talking about Last Play at Shea a couple of weeks ago, we were thinking about, is there a situation where you sort of have to tell the story again every decade or so because as a new generation of fans come up, they haven't heard these things. And then also now that he's gotten all this critical acclaim now and recognition, with the archival releases, is there ever still this feeling of winning over a few more converts, or is it about like expanding the story for people that want to know it or already know it?
I think yes to both of those. I think Billy's story in this film, if you look at the top line headlines in this film, most of these topics have been discussed. Most of these topics have been covered. They haven't been covered in complete detail, nor have they been covered from this particular angle in this particular prism. It was well reported about the unfortunate suicide attempts when he was younger. But you never knew that out of that came this click in his head that he could channel all of that anxiety into writing. So, that connection, you assumed that might have happened, but you didn't know about that. There's probably another layer of that you could tell a deeper story about. I think all great artists, if they maintain interest because of their art, how and where they got there is of interest. In Billy's case, because he's got me and he's got John Jackson now, and he's got the comfort of knowing that he's done everything he needs to do. He doesn't really have to prove anything to anybody. That I think a deeper dive into all of this stuff is something that can be welcomed. So yes, you can retell this story a lot. And I think every couple of years you can. The relationship between Billy and Elizabeth is a movie all by itself. And this is the first time that story has been told. The Billy Christie story has been told a bunch of different times in a bunch of different ways. So maybe there's a different take on that particular period of his life. I think that there will be an appetite. As long as the songs last, there will be an appetite to know how they got there. I don't think Billy has ever wanted to cheapen any of that. And I think we've always maintained a very high bar on how the stories get told. So I think the answer is yes. The other part of that I think is interesting is you've seen Billy's fan base expand. You've seen how big it is. I said to him the other day, I'm waiting for one of these tracks on the soundtrack to get viral, like Vienna or Zanzibar. There's something out there that someone's going to take Tomorrow Is Today and make a TikTok dance of it. I don't know if that's
Right.
like, there are people who appreciate the value of this work that we don't even know yet. Bob Lefsetz had a very interesting argument with a guy on his radio show the other day. For those of you who don't know, Bob Lefsetz is a blogger in the industry, and he's got a very opinionated, and he makes comments about the music industry and writes about documentaries and, you know, our world. And he didn't particularly care for the first part of the documentary. And a lot of the stuff that he said in his column was things that he wished it had. Of course, he hadn't seen part two yet, and all the things he pointed out were in part two. Anyway, long story short, he does a call-in program, and a guy called up, and he wasn't a real Billy Joel fan, but he was from New Jersey, and of course, he was a Springsteen fan. And Bob Lefsetz said to him, in 100 years, whose songs are they going to remember? Bruce Springsteen or Billy Joel? And the caller said, well, of course, Bruce Springsteen. And Bob Lefsetz said, how many covers of Bruce Springsteen songs do you know? Dead silence. And the guy said, well, what does that have to do with it? He says, a song is a song, and a song will last depending on how many people sing that song.
Yeah.
You know, and then he started
Yeah.
to list, you know, 7 covers of New York State of Mind and 12 covers of Just the Way You Are, and the fact that everybody knows Piano Man, like,
Right.
you know. So
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think that brought out in the film about the power of Billy's songwriting ability and what Sting says about Billy's songwriting ability and the construction of that music, what Bruce says about it, what Mellencamp says about it, is a guarantee for us to be able to continue to tell more stories about it because people are interested in it.
When you're reaching to Tin Pan Alley, you're subconsciously already you're using a form that was made to be played over and over again because these were by songwriters performed by others anyway. Obviously, he's expanding it and he's putting so much of his own stamp on it. But yeah, when that's the DNA of it, it
Yeah.
lends itself to be done.
Well, and his origin, you know, even Bruce says it in the film. He's got all that Tin Pan Alley and all that Broadway in him. You know, remember, he grew up listening to Gilbert and Sullivan. His lyric writing, you know, like Gilbert and Sullivan, the most clever lyricists on the planet, turning a phrase to music, like that was, you know, how the consonants and vowels were just as important as the message of the words, became part of Billy's craft as a songwriter because that's where he came from. And listen, it's not taken away from any of that other stuff. It's just that this specifically, you know, if you want to answer the question why he's still relevant, it's because it does something to you. It evokes an emotion inside of you that is a very well-worn emotion that's been figured out by a lot of songwriters over the years. He's the inheritor of that, as well as the perpetrator of it, if you want to use funny little word. But
And speaking of, you know, hitherto unknown audiences, what we've noticed in our Discord is a lot of young people, you know, people in high school and in college, they're really gravitating to Cold Spring Harbor. And I think it's because it's so sort of stripped down and raw compared to the bigger stuff.
it's funny you should say that. We were just talking about this, and I said, I got a new appreciation for Cold Spring Harbor because, you know, in the camp it was vilified. You didn't, you know,
Right.
and, you know, if I wrote a set list with, you know, hey, let's try Tomorrow Is Today, he throw a bottle at me, right? And I didn't know that stuff very well, but, you know, because we were able to uncover these demos and be able to listen to them and visually have images around them. And I literally said to him yesterday, I said, you know, I think if I had a wish, you go in the studio and re-record Cold Spring Harbor, those songs in your voice today. He says, yeah, Taylor's version. Could you imagine him singing Why Judy Why in that rich baritone that he's got now? I mean, it's like,
Wow.
it would be spectacular. You're right. I think that album will get a really nice look. And that is Jessica Levin. I have to tell you, out of all of that, she was the fearless leader about Cold Spring Harbor. This was going to have a massive chunk of this film, which is part of the reason why some of the things didn't make it, because there were certain things that just were really important in that musical legacy. And Cold Spring Harbor, you know, being one of them. People were calling in about, you know, there's nothing about David Brown, and there really would have been nice to have, you know, more expanded stories about this or about that. I don't think they told you, like, the original cut was a 3-parter. It was a 3-episode cut. First part ended before 52nd Street.
Oh, wow.
Second part ended before the end of the financial stuff with the Webbers and Christie. David Brown had a segment, and the band had a little bit more presence there, and this band had a little bit more presence, the current organization. And in the process of trying to, make this as efficient of a storytelling vehicle for Susan's vision, you got to lose stuff. It's just
You do.
unfortunate. And
Yeah.
that is something I will look forward to expanding, down the line. After the Sparks thing comes out, maybe there's a mini doc that goes along with that we talk a little bit about the
Sure.
origin of that band, and we do a little bit of a Doug Stegmeyer, David Brown, respectful retrospect and all of that stuff, because I think those guys deserve the props.
Yeah, we were just talking about that, Michael and I. The up and downside of what we're doing is, we get to put it all on the record. But the downside is so much interesting stuff gets buried. We did our Doug episode so long ago, and, I can't say enough. It's fascinating what a thread he is for almost every era of the band. And after like 150, how many episodes do we have? It just gets lost in the shuffle. And we're trying to think of ways to bubble some of this stuff back up to the top.
It becomes part of the interest factor. This guy creates so much interest in wanting to know this stuff because of the net result of the art that we're blessed with being able to, enjoy. That as long as that interest is there, these stories, I think, get bubbled up and get more daylight shown on them. So I don't think you run out of stuff.
And that's what we've been discovering too, because with the way we structure our episodes, we can cover a certain moment or era 30 times, but we come at it each time from different points of view, different perspectives. And this is how this looked within the context of what happened in the year, or how it looked in the context of the album, or such and
tour.
such. So you can slice and dice this so many ways and keep it interesting.
We're very fortunate because our guy's still alive. This is not posthumous stories. This is like, history is still being made. Whether he plays again or not is not the point. The fact that there is an active in-camp group of people that are keeping this stuff churning and uncovering these things and doing them in a way where it's not exploitive, where we're not just putting tons of stuff out there just to have it out there.
And this is a great segue too, because we're talking about just how we are able to put this stuff out online, whatever length we want. And funny enough, I was talking to Jessica. I forget what she was telling me about, but some interview she had that they couldn't use. And I said, that sounds like a great DVD extra. And she kind of laughed. She goes, what's a DVD? But what do we get to do now? As far as I know, this is the first of its kind. We have an 8-hour soundtrack to this documentary, like the ultimate companion album doesn't begin to describe what we have here.
And I'll tell you the origin of this because this is important. So when I was a very young man, one of my favorite records was an album called Frank Sinatra, A Man and His Music. And it was a retrospective. Sinatra was turning 60, I think, might have been 50. And it was his catalog up to The September of My Years, which I think was the single that came off of that record. And what it was dialogue introduction to many of these tracks. But it wasn't Frank talking about, the origin of this arrangement or the Gene Krupa guest drum bit. It was about Frank's observation of where he was at that point in his life when he recorded those songs. And I played this record forever. I mean, I made tapes of it, and it was just because it felt like Frank was in the room with me telling me his stories. When the idea for the soundtrack came up, I said that what I want to do is take the recordings that were used from the film clips that we used in the film, play them in their entirety from the formats they came with, and then utilize the dialogue that led up to those particular songs when applicable. Everyone looked at me like I had two heads. And I said, no, what you're going to get is a different experience. You're going to feel like you are in the film. Like this is a perfect companion for the film. If you can't watch it, you hear it. Billy on Sirius has gotten everybody inured to the fact that Billy talks about this kind of stuff. So it isn't like a foreign, but having John Small talk about stuff, having Elizabeth talk about stuff, doing some archive stuff, I thought would made a lot of sense. What was the first hurdle? First of all, going to HBO, because HBO paid for all these interviews. They basically owned all of that stuff. So we had to get them to license so that we could use that. And that requires lawyers talking to legal affairs, and the people at business affairs had no concept of what they were trying to license, because you can't monetize a 20-second clip because you can't download that. It has to be at least a minute. So they couldn't wrap their head around it. And they tried to like pull it apart. Well, if we could do it this way. And I just kept saying, guys, this is not about that. This is about giving the viewer an experience to take that film with them in their car, to take that film with them to the gym. The other hurdle was the third-party licensing. We had 2 performances from Saturday Night Live. I was not going to replace Only the Good Die Young and Miami 2017 with other performances of those. The things that make them great is Chevy Chase introducing Billy Joel and it being on Saturday Night Live, sounding like it did on Saturday Night Live, or the Miami 2017 sounding like it did without Richie Cannata because he wasn't available to do that show.
Right.
So like those were really important. Well, you got to call up Lorne Michaels and you got to get Chevy Chase's thing. So that was another hurdle that they had to go over. The hassles is on United Artists. You had to go to Universal and they don't license to Sony because there's turf, there's a line in the sand. So that had to have somebody make a phone call and say, hey, this is Billy Joel wanting to put this on his soundtrack and he's on that. What are you holding out for? Because people didn't understand that we were trying to break a little bit of the norm. And we had no time to do this. My idea came up while we were in Final Cut. Tara, who's unbelievable, Tara Brew at Sony, made, a Herculean effort to get everybody in line to get this stuff done. At the same time, when they were negotiating use rights for the promo clips and for the trailer, so there was some horse trading that had to go on. It was fascinating, but because we're in a different environment, we didn't have to be 3 months out to press albums, and it was a streaming product. We knew that we could get this done if there was a will to get this done. Up until it got posted for streaming, there were still some tracks that were grayed out because the licensing wasn't completely cleared. Now it's all clear. So now you can stream the entire thing. It took me 3 days to get through it, because I would listen to it in 20, 30-minute bites or an hour bites while I was on the treadmill in the gym. Everyone I've talked to that has listened to it said, it's like this unique thing. It's kind of like a podcast, but it's got really extended music and you feel like you're part of it. So I love that Billy drops the massive 155 track soundtrack, how they blow it up.
Right.
But in fact, I think it's a unicorn. I don't think anybody's ever done anything like this. And it really is the companion.
And not only that, but what a surprise it was for everybody. There was no murmur of it until just the eve of it actually coming out. And immediately after part 2 aired as well. So the timing of it was fantastic.
Well, we took a page from Justin Bieber. Nobody told him it. He didn't tell anybody he was dropping an album either.
It's the way it goes these days.
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying. In this day and age, the rules don't apply. So the common rules don't apply. So, the other part about this that I was really sensitive to, and this is my thing, Brian Ruggles is my dearest, oldest friend. He hired me, 51 years ago. 85% of the live tracks were mixed, by him. And the other 15% of the live tracks were mixed live to whatever medium that they were recorded on. So it's Brian's work. They can't go in and fix. Like, it is what it is. And I had to tell him, Brian, you have to listen to this with a little bit of a different ear. These are moment in time performances. These are pieces that are only captured right there. It's like when you went to see a live show and you didn't have a cell phone to record it. Like that, that's it. And we're capturing these moments that are only the last time people had them was in their memories. And you have to kind of look at it that way and give yourself a little bit of distance. He's a perfectionist. And they were mastering it and they were sending it to him. He's going, I keep getting these things. It's like, isn't Angry Young Man a little distorted? It's like, yeah, but that's how it sounded. Like, oh, okay. And Brad, I have to say, Brad went in and massaged these pieces so beautifully because some of them were really bad.
Sure.
So Brad was able to lift them, take the noise out of them, re-EQ them, bounce them, create some space without screwing with the real structure of these songs. But there's some gems. There's a recording of For the Longest Time.
Yes.
That was the guys in the band, and I think Bob Duncan and the Sims and
Peter Hewlett.
I think John Small came to shoot some stuff, some B-roll or something, and they were in, you know how Billy always talks about it sounds best when you sing in a bathroom. He
Yeah.
brought them all into the shower in the dressing room. We set up one camera and they sing for the longest time a cappella in a bathroom, in a shower. And like that's on the recording. Like
Right.
when would you ever imagine you're backstage with Billy and the band and they're singing in the bathroom? Like,
Yeah.
Right.
you know, you can't go in and fix that.
Yeah.
Exactly.
You can't auto-tune that shit. That's like
Yeah.
it is. And you hear how great they are.
Yeah.
You know?
Absolutely. Speaking of Brad as well, too, I know in us talking with him a lot over the last couple of years, he was so thrilled to be able to get his hands on Cold Spring Harbor. He was so like, I finally get to restore it to the correct speed, the correct pitch. And I wanted to feel right for the first time. And I know that was so important to him. What was that experience like for you, hearing those songs come to life again?
I heard them for the first time. Cold Spring Harbor finally got remastered at the right speed, but it had a bunch of already ripped strings in it. It was cocked up. The production was cocked up even when it got fixed. It was pretty much unlistenable to me.
Well, what's interesting, Steve, sorry to interrupt, in talking with Brad, because I knew he was working on the tracks, and he and I were going back and forth for weeks between the 83 version and the various 71 pressings. And we both came to the conclusion, they're like, their attempt to correct the speed in 83, they overcompensated on a few songs. So those aren't even quite correct in a lot of spots.
I think the thing that got me is that, you know, a couple of the basic tracks, the piano vocal stuff is the songs themselves really came to life. But I think a real re-release of a newly minted version is due, and I think that's going to happen. I think it has to. I mean, I'm going to hold out for Billy to sing these again, but
Right.
Right. You know, every time we go into an era with Billy's career, it's always like the transitions between eras and where he was at during these transitions. And no more drastic was the transition between Attila and in 70
Cold
and
Spring
just
Harbor.
months later, Cold Spring Harbor. And we love to get into the minutia of like what big pivots were made at these little fractions of time.
And the documentary shows you the biggest pivot of his life, which is you're having fun, you're playing with your best friend, you're drinking, you're working at night, you're doing everything you want to do, and you fall in love, and you fall in love with the wrong person, and your whole life explodes. I happen to, know both of them, both Elizabeth and John, very well, obviously. Both of their observations of that period of time are unique to them. It's, it's that Rashomon effect, like everybody sees it from a different angle.
Yeah.
But what I do know is Billy has always had this really deep desire for love. And it's sometimes to his detriment, in a lot of ways, as we've seen throughout his life. What I found most interesting in the documentary was that I was able to see concrete that switch, that, love took him in a direction that changed his life and changed all of ours because of it. The whole story about him writing these songs and passing the tape to Josephine to get to Elizabeth, that's touched upon. But if you listen to, Everybody Loves You Now, you can imagine the intensity of that fight, the fight that they had before he went and wrote that. Like
Right.
every single one of those songs are
Yeah.
so deep emotional responses to his life experience with this woman that he's now allowed us, both of them have allowed us to be observers in.
Yeah.
I think that that's really brave of Elizabeth and really brave of Billy. One of the things we all know about Bill is that, like Springsteen says, he doesn't really just go there. Well, he's been that way about the origin of these songs for as long as I know him. Yeah, they're kind of about me. Yeah, they're kind of about that person. You just make it up, you just fill in the blanks and make them a part of, and which is why they become popular, which is why they're part of people's lives so deeply. Now that he's allowed us to know the origin of how these songs evolved and who they were about, we get to listen to them as if they're new again through a completely different lens. Maybe we still feel the same way about them, but there's another part of me that listens to You May Be Right, picturing him actually driving, home on that motorcycle and having that argument with her, and her actually saying, you're out of your mind. Yeah, but I'm here. I try to wonder what it would be like to have the conversation with Jackson Pollock, or have a conversation with Picasso when he's painting Guernica, and like to sit there with, with Beethoven, feeling those emotions while they're creating this stuff. And, that's a gift. And that's really a gift that Billy has given us, to be able to do all that. He gave Jessica, and he gave Susan. So we're all very fortunate because of it. If you're not a fan, I defy you not to find some value in that, because art is art, whether you like that particular piece of art or not.
Obviously, Jack and I know folks who are big fans, and then casuals, and some who just don't even know the hits and in passing and don't really think much else. But a lot of folks who saw it said, I really had a deeper appreciation for what he did and what his career was. It touched a lot of people, no matter where they were at the stage of awareness of Billy.
Yeah, I think for people that weren't fans, it really humanized Billy for a lot of people for whom it was easier to write him off.
Yeah.
And they were, confronted with a really three-dimensional portrait of him.
Dennis Arf and I have this ongoing conversation of what's the why, like the why of it. Like, why do we sell out the way we sell out? Why at 65 years old does this guy become a multiple stadium act? Why do people keep coming for a guy who hasn't written a new song in 40 plus and 30 some odd years? And we all have our own particular, take on it. And I said to him when we started this that I hope that this film answers that question. And I think it has, because I think the why is these songs. And I think that these songs strike a chord, pun intended, in everyone in a way that there is an emotional reaction that releases something in you that makes you feel good. I think that's the reason that people kept coming back to Madison Square Garden. I have this story I tell about looking around the audience and seeing, guys like us, a little bald, a little heavy, a little whatever, singing at the top of our lungs. And when you're in your shower and you're singing at the top of your lungs, you sound great. You think you're Frank Sinatra, you think you're Bruce Springsteen, you think you're Billy Joel. Then you go to the Garden and you see this guy on stage who kind of looks like you, thick around the waist, bags under the eyes, and you're singing. You not only think you sound like him, but you think you are him.
Right.
For a minute, you transfer that, and you actually can feel that energy. That makes you keep, coming back to get that feeling again. And then when the lyrics, resonate with something that you have in your life experience, that's why people keep coming. That's the why. That's the why. It isn't just how great it is, it's how great it makes you feel. And he's as humble as anybody about it. He really is. One of the things he explained to Susan Lacey quite recently was why he doesn't compliment himself or other people, because he believes that the accomplishments that we do are precious and fragile. And if you pay too much attention and give it too much light, it'll disappear and you'll jinx it. And he taught me that a long time ago. I think I said that on one of the podcasts with you before. It's like, he said to me a long time ago, like, show up, do the best you can, and just leave the results up to the universe. Like, don't try and figure it out, because if you try and figure it out, it'll slip right through your hands. And I think, that's a pretty great way to live, right?
Yeah, it's like looking at something out of the corner of your eye. It's going to disappear if you actually look at it directly.
And that served me well in my career, not paying too much heed to the accomplishments, but being very mindful of the work.